My story begins, I grew up in Melbourne, Victoria, in the back of a fruit shop. My grandparents came out from Italy, and I lived in the back for a while with other uncles and aunties and all my cousins. So I grew up in a very community-based environment where if I ever wanted someone to talk to, I had a relative or someone who I could trust who had my back. And that was really important. It was a wonderful foundation for me to have that, platform of support and love whenever I needed it. Then Mum and Dad finally afforded their own little home in Richmond, in Victoria. Unfortunately, to my dad's disgust, I became a one-eyed Collingwood supporter because that was where I was born, even though we lived in Richmond. So he'd take us 3 kids to the football on a Saturday, and I would have my Collingwood jersey on, my brother would have Richmond, and my sister would have Hawthorn. I have no idea how that happened. But Dad would just shake his head in complete disappointment and think, well, I got one right, and that was his son, It's very funny. But then, fairly early on, I realised I was a little bit different. I was the eldest daughter of a large Italian family. I'm related to half of Melbourne. And it's a nice thing to have, right? However, when things don't go right in life, it's like you think the internet is interconnected. Try being part of an Italian family, right? So I got married when I was 22. And the only reason I got married was I was expected to. My sister was about 18 when she declared her undying love for her boyfriend and wanted to get married. Dad sat me down and said, "What's the matter with you?" And I said, "I don't understand." He said, "You're 20 years old. You don't even have a boyfriend. You've never had a boyfriend. What's the matter with you? You need to get married." And in those days, I felt like a disappointment. I was like, wow, I'm not interested. I'm happy for her to get married. He said, "No. In this culture, the eldest daughter gets married first because you're the eldest." No pressure. So I ended up meeting someone at work. I was working at the State Bank of Victoria at the time. And I don't know that I really knew what love was, but I did what I thought I was meant to do. And, got into a relationship and got married. Not really understanding, what this thing called love was all about. Then 2 years into that marriage, I started experiencing physical discomfort in my throat. I went and ignored it for a while, as we do, and then had it investigated. And the doctor said, "Look, I think it's just glandular fever. It's nothing, but we'll do an ultrasound just to be sure." They discovered there was a little tumour in my thyroid. And he said, "Look, you're 24, you never drank, you never smoked. I was teaching aerobics part-time. I was pretty fit and healthy. So they made an assumption, we won't bother with a biopsy, you'll be fine." So I went in and had surgery. But what we discovered was that it was cancer, it was malignant, it was stage 3. And that when we were actually given that news, my then husband was sitting beside me. The doctor looked at me and he said, "Josie, we need to do a second surgery because of what it is. And we've disturbed it, we only took 1/2 out. When can we do it?" And I couldn't talk because I'd been cut across my throat. And I managed to write down, "If you don't do this tomorrow morning, I'm never going to let you touch me again." So the thing I knew was if I had time to think, I was going to freak out. So we actioned that very quickly, very swiftly. But when my husband left that night, I never saw him again. And this is what can happen sometimes when we lack that emotional maturity. 24 years old, you're not really equipped with what's required to handle such a situation. And this was in 1991. And in 1991, nobody in my whole family or relatives had ever had cancer. I'd heard of a distant auntie that had had breast cancer several years before, but the word cancer wasn't something you actually heard a lot about. Whereas you look at life today, it's nearly 1 in 3. And that's a whole other conversation that I'm really passionate about. So that was actually the event that became pivotal for me in forging my own path in the world. And so all of a sudden I had permission to speak up to have my own voice heard, to know what my own truth was, to seek my own answers. Up until then, I was the obedient eldest daughter. My middle name was duty and obligation, and my priority and focus was about pleasing and appeasing other people, particularly those people that I loved and respected and held in high regard. I wasn't consciously aware that that came at great personal cost. So for me, we had the second surgery. I was in intensive care for a week. I flatlined twice, so I physically died twice, and experienced the most phenomenal thing about, well, you've probably read about it before, the near-death experiences, where I physically left my body and I could see my body on the bed below me, and I was completely aware that I was up here somewhere floating, and it was completely serene, it was completely peaceful, there was no fear. It was amazing, but I could see the activity of the nurses attending to my physical body. I was aware that that was me, but somehow I was here. And I could see the panic down there and the flat line on the screen. And I was like in this beautiful, blissful state. And then all of a sudden I heard this really assertive male voice come in at the left side of me saying, "It's not your time yet." And in an instant I was back in my physical body. And that happened again within hours of the first episode. And I still have very vivid recollection of that, like it happened yesterday. During that week, I was in and out of consciousness, and I wasn't aware of the conversations I was actually having with very limited visitors that were allowed to come and see me. So I was in a very fragile state. And apparently Mum and Dad and my brother and sister came, and I apparently told them I loved them, which I never used to do. In those days, we knew Mum and Dad loved us fiercely through their acts of service. But they never actually said the words, like we tend to be more open about it these days with each other and with our children. They weren't words that I often got to hear at all from my parents, but I knew they loved me. There was no doubt about it through the way they went about attending and caring for me and my family. But apparently I did say that, and I'm like, gross, I would never say that to my brother. No way, but I so do. But anyway, I accept that. And apparently one of my girlfriends, Sharon, came to visit me, and she was juggling. And I remember regaining consciousness, and I'm watching her juggling by my bed. And I looked at her and I went, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm juggling." And I go, "Why?" And she's like, "Because you asked me to." And I was out again. So there's these random moments in between all of that I do recall. But one thing I will tell you is that when you're in that unconscious state, while you're not actually communicating with people around you, you hear everything, you hear it all. I heard everything. I knew what was going on in that room, even though my conscious self was out. And that was fascinating, to be able to have that experience. And after that, I started questioning everything about my reality. I questioned God. I questioned everything I'd been brought up to believe in. And I started not only asking big questions, but I was set to actually determine my own answers and to seek my own truth, to understand what life really was about. It wasn't this inherited set of beliefs and prescribed doctrines that we're meant to live life by. We've got to find our own path in life. And for me, I had to be handballed into this position. I'm Taurian, I'm female, I'm pretty stubborn, and I'm Italian. Add that to the mix. And so I was put into a situation where I all of a sudden realised I had free will. And so I could consciously forge my own path forward according to my own truths. But I had to discover what that was. I was so busy trying to attend to everybody else's needs that I'd forgotten who I was. I didn't know who I was. And I started radioactive iodine treatment. And in those days, I was actually offered a pretty intensive intravenous radiation treatment because they were concerned that I had spots of thyroid cells spreading in my body. They don't offer this now because they now realise it actually kills people. But in those days, I was naive and I trusted the word of the experts. So I was hospitalised in a radiation ward in a room, sealed for a whole week, where no one was allowed to enter except my doctor, who came in with a full suit that was lead-lined, you know, those heavy suits, like as if you're going out of space. And my food was actually just slipped under a door, under a flap. All waste had to stay in the room. I felt like a leper. I could have no visitors. There was no mobile phones or any technology in the room. It was a pretty profound week of my life. When the doctor said to me, Josie, you've got 6 months to live, I remember hearing the words, and it was almost like it was very surreal. I heard the words, I was naive, and said, because I was a bit of an analyst, because I worked in finance and tax, and I'm all about numbers, and I looked at him and I said, how do you know that for sure? And then he started giving me an answer that I wasn't satisfied with. So what I got from his response was just a gap in the story that he was telling me. And it was enough for me to go, right, I'm going for that gap. So even though you're saying I've got 6 months to live, you can't tell me, guarantee, that that's a truth. So I'm going to go for the gap. So I set about restructuring my life and making really fierce, brave, difficult decisions to align my life choices with what I wanted, which was to actually get well. So while I was having treatment, I got a phone call from BHP in Brisbane. I was working for BHP in Melbourne at the time. And I still remember John Wanmaker, head of HR, rings me up and said, these were his words, I hope you don't get offended by a little bit of a swear word in here. He said, why the bloody hell haven't you applied for this job? And like I knew that there was this job going in Brisbane, but I didn't apply because I wasn't well. And I said, well, I'm having treatment at the moment. And he said, well, that's no excuse. Get your butt up here for an interview. So the next week I did. I was really weak. I came up for an interview, left Melbourne, freezing cold, rain. You can imagine the temperature. Arrived in Brisbane on a day like this, stood on the tarmac, lifted the sleeves on my suit, and I still remember I stood there for about a minute and just absorbed the rays and the warmth of the sun. And for that 1 minute, I felt well. So I went and had the interview. I was offered the job on the spot. Then this wild panic arose. My head was saying, don't be stupid. You need the support of your family, right? My heart was saying, go. So that night I prayed and said, look, I don't know the answer. Let me know by morning what I need to do. I woke up so calm the next morning knowing I needed to go. So again, I took no time on this decision. I rang up and said, right, I'm coming. Because I knew if I had too much time to think about it, I would have backed out. So I moved to Brisbane, right in the middle of all of that. Came up here, ceased all treatment, decided that the sun was going to heal me, decided to change my diet, decided to study. I've got about 200 books about cancer at home. I wanted to understand, what is this thing? How does it work? How do people get it? Why did I get it? How do you treat this? How do you survive? And I wanted to understand it more and more. And the more questions I asked, the more questions I had. So I changed everything about my lifestyle and I got well. And the thing that I learned that I did, that I didn't realise at the time, was I focused my attention fiercely and unashamedly on what I wanted, and that was to get well. So every decision I made in my life had to complement and support that outcome. So I even gave up chocolate, like, hello, who does that, right? And got to understand the nature of nutrition and how it affects our health and well-being. If that wasn't enough, I met my next husband. I'm not in a habit of collecting these, okay? 7 years on. And I remember that first date, I was so nervous because of the experience I'd had where you made a vow to someone that says in sickness and in health, blah, blah, and then it wasn't true. So you can imagine what I was like. I had like the Great Wall of China between me and my heart. No one was going to permeate that. And I remember on the first date, we're sitting and I said, look, before you order dinner, you need to know something. And he's going, okay, you know. I said, I'm a cancer patient and I've been divorced. So if you want to order dinner, great, but you need to know that. And he's like, shit, okay, well, let's talk. And he didn't run away. So that was the first tick, right? And then we would just be able to just unfurl and be really honest and open with one another. And it was great. He lived in Moranbah, I lived in Brisbane, and we had this distance thing for a while as we got to know one another. It had to be that way for me to safely step into that space again. Eventually we got married, and I was absolutely blessed with 2 miracle children that I was told I probably couldn't have because of all the treatments I'd had. And I remember when I was pregnant the first time, my doctor rang me because I had blood tests, and he said, Josie, can you come down and see me? And you can imagine when a doctor says that to you, what you think, right? So I get in there and he goes, sit down. I said, no, I want to stand. He said, you're pregnant. And I looked at him and I said, you're joking. And he said, no, you're pregnant. And so then I sat down and he went through all the results, and I said, you sure? He goes, yeah, I'm sure. So I remember flying back to the office, interrupting my husband in a meeting and saying, oh, you're freaking out, telling him this news. He nearly fainted. And it was the most delightful experience. You know, my firstborn arrived on 9/11. I call her my 9/11. She was born on the 9th of November, 1997, and she transformed my world and showed me and taught me what unconditional love feels like. For the first time in my life, I knew what it was. I thought I'd known, but this is when it's real. And then 2 years later, I got to greet my own little baby boy, who's, you know, just my sunshine. He really is. And so I live for those 2 beings. The relationship grew apart. The thing about relationships that I've learned is when you get married, you become a couple. Then you start introducing children. That relationship has to become a partnership. And if it doesn't transform into a partnership where you partner together and grow and learn and assist and support one another in that journey, you're going to end up growing apart. And unfortunately, that's what happened with us. So at that time, I also started studying this new field at the time called neuroscience. Why did I study that? I don't know. I was just fascinated by it because I knew I'd survived. And now all of a sudden, people that I knew were starting to be diagnosed with cancer, and they were dying with lesser cancers than what I had. And I was curious, there's got to be something more in this that I don't understand. So I decided to do executive master's studies in neuroscience, which I finished a few years ago. As a consequence of that, I got to understand what I did right to give myself maximum potential for a radical recovery. Can everyone do it? No, they can't, right? But is it possible? Yes, it is. And I see miracles all the time. As Ambassador for Childhood Cancer Support, and you'll hear about that a little bit later, I get to spend time with walking miracles all the time. These kids teach me what resilience is. I thought I knew it. You know, there's a story, there's a photo up there of me and little Devlin. He's a gorgeous little kid. And I remember, you know, when he was diagnosed with sarcoma in his foot, they didn't know how much of his leg they would have to amputate. When he woke up from surgery, his mother Elvira was sitting beside him, and he woke up, he looked at his mum, he looked at his leg, he looked at his mum, he looked at his leg. He goes, Mum! She goes, yes, son. He goes, the cancer's gone. Right? Not my foot's gone, the cancer's gone, right? He's just extraordinary. And I remember I saw him, I spent a bit of time with him through the treatment space, but then I saw him about a year after he got into remission. And he'd grown his hair and he had jeans on, and I didn't recognise him. And he came running up to me, wrapped his arms around me. And I went, who are you? He goes, it's Devlin. I said, no, it's not. He goes, it is. I said, no, it's not. He goes, it is. I'll show you. And he sat down, lifted up the jeans, pulled his leg off and went, see? I went, okay, it's Devlin, you know. And so, you know, when you see the spirit of children who kind of don't focus on the loss or the life they had prior to whatever this massive change was, you see what's possible in adapting your strategy and how you embrace life to continue on, but not just to continue, but to thrive and continue to grow and learn. So I've learned a lot from being part of childhood cancer support, and you'll hear more about them a little bit later on when Helen introduces. So I finished my master's studies. What I learned there is that we have so much, not only potential, but capacity to transform our thinking, which then has a direct impact on the quality of our lives and our performance outcomes. So what I realised is I all of a sudden understood that there was a fierce connection between how we think and not only how we feel, but how we either get better or bitter about our lives. And so my passion now is to take everything that's happened to me and be of service to other people so that I know that what's happened to me actually serves a much higher and greater good. I actually had another surgery last year in October that took me completely by surprise. And it was misdiagnosed again. So I was having symptoms that created a lot of pain and discomfort and bleeding. Went to the doctors and was told, a person of your age is likely to have these symptoms, so it'll be fine as you go through menopause, it'll sort itself out. But these symptoms persisted, and you know what? Our bodies are incredible vehicles for wisdom. You must listen to what your body is telling you. So I did, and I went back to the doctor. They did an ultrasound and said, no, you've just got fibroids, don't worry about it, it's okay. But it wasn't stopping. I was anemic at this stage. And I had an ab, not abs, one ab. It was huge, and I knew it wasn't muscle because I wasn't exercising. And so I went back and I said, look, I need an MRI and I need a CT scan. And the doctor said, if you want that, you need to pay for it yourself. I said, fine, I'll do that. But that night, I had a phone call saying, can you please come and see us tomorrow? So I knew that there was something wrong. So when I went in the next day, they said, it's not a fibroid. It was a tumour and it was the size of a football. Right? So I had to have that operated on the following week. I went through 2 surgeons who refused to touch me. The first one, which was a surprise, because he was the guy that delivered both my children, and he said, sorry, Josie, I'm not going to do the surgery. And I looked at him, I said, why not? I want you to do it. I trust you. He said, Josie, based on your history, I'm not going to touch you. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, it's probably cancer. And at that moment, I freaked out. I lost my bumble. I started crying. And he said, did you not make that connection? And I looked at him and I said, no, I actually did not. This is completely separate to thyroid and brain tumour. Like, how can you make that deduction without fact? Do you know that? And he said, no, but I won't do it. I won't take that risk. So you can imagine, I freaked out. That brings up other issues for me. So then I went and saw another surgeon, and she was similar. She said, look, I'm not comfortable doing this surgery. So I found an oncological surgeon who was prepared, obviously, to do this surgery for me. And thankfully, I sat down in my only meeting with him, surgery, and I said to him, right, you're going to get one shot at this. You better do it well because I'm not having treatment. So take whatever you need out because this is it. And he's like, okay. So we went in, he took the whole lot out, and it's been a successful surgery. But as a consequence of it, it was quite a huge one. I was out for 3 months, couldn't walk properly, couldn't do stairs, so my son had to piggyback me upstairs for those 3 months. And again, it gave me an opportunity to stop and be still and listen to what my body was trying to tell me. So here's what I learned from those 3 experiences. So when my throat was cut open, I found my voice. When my head was cut open, I stopped over-analysing and overthinking life and started feeling my way. I also was forced to be still because I couldn't walk or talk for 6 months. So I learned to meditate and I learned to allow my body to heal itself. And then with this latest surgery, what I learned was when we suppress, we actually get depressed. And I'd suppressed so much emotion over the years to put on this mask that I presented to the world of someone who's, you know, confident and has her life together and she can get out there and do whatever she wanted, because I never wanted people to see my vulnerability, especially, you know, in relationship. I didn't want people to see that they were affecting me. So what I would do is swallow a lot of that down. And so where do we house it? In our belly. So for me, it was a clearing. It was a clearing of all that old stuff so that I can make space for a new approach to life. And that's where I'm at now. So I've entered my 50th year. I just celebrated my 50th birthday. And this is when, you know, life's really starting in a whole new way for me now. I like who I am. I'm much more comfortable in my own skin. I don't care if you don't like me. But I know I'm a good person, and I know I'm here to serve for the greater good. So I will draw my last breath doing that. And I know my life will be worthwhile because it's not about me. It's about servicing humanity. And I remember my son when he was in grade 7. He is now in grade 12, about to finish his final year at school. 6'2", eats me out of house and home. When he was in grade 7, he had an assignment about poverty. And his closing line, the teacher rang me and said, I can't believe this. His closing line on that assignment was, we must not fight against poverty. We must fight for humanity. And I think we can all draw from that, because in life, if you're fighting against something, you are actually resourcing and amplifying the very thing you don't want. So if this is the one thing you get out of my talk with you today, is that you need to focus your attention forward on what you actually want, because the resources you draw from in that focused attention is much more adaptive, much more innovative, much more creative, and gives you a lot more hope for a brighter tomorrow. My daughter's in third year uni. She's studying science, and she's also studying business. Now, she is the one that's given me my grey hairs over the years. And what I love about her is that she was never going to be contained. And I remember going into a coaching session with one of my CEOs one day, and we'd had a bit of a words exchange with my daughter, who didn't come home the night before. And he said to me, what's your problem today? And I told him what had happened. He started laughing. And I said, why are you laughing? He said, look at what you do for a job. You take people to the edge of their potential and then you go, fly. Why are you expecting anything different from your child? And it was one of these blinding flash of insight for me. I went home that night, I apologised to Kristen and I said, I've been seeing you as a problem. And I need to see you as an opportunity for me to grow and learn from you. And I love that you don't want to be contained, because I won't be either. And I can see that that's why we clashed. So can we work together so that you get what you need and I get what I need to know that we can live safely? And that was transformative for us to just share that together. So if I'm going to leave you with one big thing, it would be this, that pain in life is inevitable. That's how we get to learn and grow. Suffering is optional. We do that to ourselves. Growth is intentional. Okay? So it's not what happens to you that defines you, it's how you respond that counts. That's it. I hope that was useful for you.
So let's open for some questions. We've got time for a few questions, if there is anyone.
You talked about, I guess, particularly with the most recent time out, that value in stopping and being still. And I just wondered if you're coaching leaders, just what sort of tips you give them around how to do that?
Definitely, mindfulness and meditation are part of my everyday practice now. In fact, I think the way I go about most things that I do every day has become a mindful practice. With leaders, I do that in many, many ways. In fact, There's a book that's been published in January, which is a collaboration between myself and Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz, who's the leading neuroscientist in the world on OCD, on mindfulness and neuroplasticity, and a guy called Art Kleiner, who's the editor for Strategy and Business magazine. And that book's all about wise leadership. And the big thing, the central concept in that book is all about this concept of what's called the wise advocate. And the wise advocate is that, like an impartial spectator that exists inside our minds, that allows us to have this third person perspective on what we're actually physically doing and how we're thinking. So I've been working with Dr. Schwartz's 4 steps model for years. It's a really powerful way of transforming thinking, ending unhealthy habits and taking charge of your life. So, and it also focuses on breath awareness to center people and get people into mindful states so they're aware and able to observe what they're doing rather than get absorbed in the experience of what's going on.
Any more questions?
I'm curious about anxiety and fear.
Yeah. So I know what fear feels like, and there has definitely been experience of incredible anxiety throughout this whole process for me. I wrote a chapter on conquering fear, which I'm happy to share with you if you would like to send me an email. Fear is a result of the way we perceive the world around us. And it's usually based on a narrative that we're telling ourselves, which isn't always entirely accurate. However, what happens is this is why it's important to understand the distinction between the mind and the brain. So the mind is where the narrative comes from. The brain is the engine that just materializes it, right? The processing system. So fear comes from this thought, this narrative that says something feels wrong. The brain feels it and goes, means there must be wrong. So unless you're paying mindful awareness to that automatic response to the trigger, then you're just going to be led down this habitual path of patterned thought and behaviour that isn't necessarily true and accurate. So fear is a narrative. There are real fears, like standing on an edge about to jump off, but a lot of the fears and anxieties that we experience are due to the narratives and the stories we're telling ourselves about what we perceive to be reality. So what I say to people is, how's that working for you? And then it's like, can you choose a better thought? Choose a thought that feels better. You know, because if you can choose that, you can choose something else. There are very effective ways of managing fear and anxiety. And the tips that I would suggest come from the work of Dr. Matthew Lieberman out of UCLA, where he says, first thing you've got to do is label your feeling. What are you feeling? Name it. Once you name it, you put a torch on it, and all of a sudden it goes from this felt sense to this certainty for your body, where the brain goes, oh, thank goodness she knows I'm here. I'm scared, I'm fearful, I'm worried, I'm anxious, whatever. But there's a difference between labeling your emotion and rumination. Rumination makes it worse. Rumination means, tell me the story about why you feel that way. See, so what I'm doing when I do that is I'm actually amplifying the emotion. You don't want to do that. So you might want to just say, I'm scared right now. That's the first step. The second thing you do is what's called reappraisal or reframe, which means take a walk around or step back. Get a broader lens on what's going on. Because right now you're telling yourself a story based on a set of data that you're focusing your attention on. But guess what? There's all this other data points out here that you're not even looking at. But if you actually broaden the lens on that, your narrative will change. You've heard that quote that says, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. Exactly the same. Hard to do when you're in that captured state of emotion, right? The third step is distancing. So actually giving yourself a break from the trigger. Take a walk, phone a friend, have a glass of water. Do something that's unrelated to what's going on. It's actually good for you and good to you. Sleep on it if you can. And then the final thing is mindfulness and meditation, which really helps you to just return to a state of peace
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Josie. You inspire me. So we've established a little bit of a tradition with our Lean In chapter that we like to get to know a little bit more about you.
All right.
So are you ready?
All right.
What were you like as a little girl?
Feisty.
What's that?
Like my daughter.
Ah.
You tell me what to do and I'll go, no, not doing it.
Love it. What was the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to you?
Ever. I've got to say, literally jumping into a lift with Sir John Prescott. He was the then CEO of BHP and he had his own private lift. And by accident, his lift opened up one day. And I have this habit, if no one's around, I don't just enter a lift, I actually run and I just jump. And I did that. And then all of a sudden I realised there were eyes behind me and it was him. And I looked around and he had this smirk on his face. That was pretty embarrassing. But can I share one more?
Come on.
I was also responsible for writing the affirmative action report for BHP years ago. And the CEO at the time then was Jerry Ellis. And he had to sign this report. And one of our mine sites submitted their report with one sentence. And it said, no women, no problems. And so I went, right, I'm going to leave that in the report. So I left it in there, knowing that I wouldn't leave it in the final version. But I put it in there just to see if he actually read the report, right? So I get a phone call from his office saying, Josie, come up and collect the report. Jerry's wanting to talk to you. I said, okay. So I went up there and I had a spare copy of that page without that line in it, behind my hat, my back. And he said, here's the report. I said, did you sign it? He said, yep. I said, did you read it? He said, yep. I said, all of it? And he knew he was onto something now. He said, yeah? I said, check page 17, 4B. And he went over, had a look, and he was like, right. So we swiftly swapped it over and took that out of the report. I thought that was a magic moment.
Well done. Tell us about a book that you've loved.
Okay, book that I've loved. I would have to say Captain Underpants and His Adventures with my son. I have spent hours reading those books with him and we laugh. So I'd have to say that.
Love it. What's in your fridge?
A lot of food. I'm an Italian, right? It's full.
I love it. And tell us about your greatest adventure.
Greatest adventure? I would have to say would be my sabbaticals to Egypt. So I've been there twice now. Last year I was actually away from work for 5 weeks, and that was almost a return to home for me. So I would say that would definitely be it.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that as well.
Thank you.